I never expected to be the kind of man who would systematically dismantle his own family. But then again, they never expected me to be the kind of man who was paying attention. My name is Julian. For 28 years, I was the human equivalent of white noise, always present, rarely noticed, and entirely essential to the background hum of my family's survival. I was the low-maintenance child. The one who didn't need the specialized tutors, the one who didn't crash the car into the neighbor's hydrangea bushes, the one who didn't need a 5-figure branding consultant to tell him how to exist in the world. In the lexicon of my mother's pride, low maintenance was simply a polite euphemism for disposable. I work in systems architecture. I spend my days designing digital fortresses, mapping out fail-safes, and identifying the single point of failure that can bring a billion-dollar infrastructure to its knees. It's a job that requires a certain clinical detachment, a way of looking at a complex web of connections and knowing exactly which thread to pull to make the whole thing unravel. I didn't realize until very recently that my family was just another system. A poorly designed one, held together by my silence and my bank account. The rain was a cold, rhythmic drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my apartment the night the switch finally flipped. I was staring out at the city, watching the lights of Manhattan blur into neon streaks, when the first notification chimed. It was a group text. No hello, no how are you, just a high-resolution burst of light, a 3-carat pear-shaped diamond catching the flash of a camera. The caption was a string of emojis, champagne, hearts, and a crown. My sister, Sienna, had finally snared her prize. Tyler. A man who possessed the personality of a beige wall and the financial foresight of a moth, but he had the right look for her aesthetic. He was the perfect accessory for a woman whose entire reality was curated for 43,000 strangers on the internet. Behind that ring was a mountain of debt, a trail of broken promises, and the quiet expectation that I would, as always, be the one to provide the safety net when the glitter settled. I looked at the phone, then back at the rain. For years, I had a kill switch for my emotions when it came to them. I could dampen the sting of the forgotten birthdays and the ignored promotions. I could mute the frustration of being called the tech guy, as if I repaired printers for a living instead of building the backbone of the very platforms they used to ignore me. But that night, as I watched the congratulations messages flood the chat from relatives I hadn't seen in years, I felt a different kind of sensation. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I didn't reach for the phone to type a response. Instead, I opened a terminal window on my laptop. The cursor blinked, steady and patient. A digital heartbeat. I began to look at the architecture of my life. I saw every sacrifice I'd made, the graduate school fund I'd dipped into to pay for Sienna's wellness retreat 3 years ago, the weekends I spent acting as her unpaid crisis manager when her brand deals went south. I realized that my invisibility was my greatest asset. They didn't see me as a person, they saw me as a utility. And the thing about utilities is that you only notice them when they're cut off. I decided, right there in the dark with the rain as my only witness, that I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to be the invisible hand that guided Sienna toward her dream. I just didn't tell her it was a dream she would never wake up from. The engagement party was held 3 weeks later at a place called the Apex. It was one of those ultra-modern rooftop bars where the furniture is designed to be photographed rather than sat upon, and the air smells of expensive gin and desperation. Everything about the venue screamed Sienna. It was hollow, shimmering, and overpriced. Sloane and I arrived exactly on time. Sloane is my partner in every sense of the word, a clinical psychologist who can read a room before she's even crossed the threshold. She wore a dress the color of midnight, a stark contrast to the sea of pastel silks and linen suits that made up Sienna's inner circle. As we stepped out of the elevator, the wall of sound hit us, the clinking of crystal, the curated playlist of indie pop, and the high-pitched, performative laughter of people who knew they were being watched. I felt it immediately. That subtle, familiar shift in the atmosphere. It's the feeling of walking into a room where you are technically a guest, but emotionally an intruder. We moved toward the main seating area, a long, white marble table adorned with orchids and hand-calligraphed name cards. I scanned the row. My mother was at the head, looking like she'd finally achieved her life's ambition of being the matriarch of a dynasty. My father was beside her, looking slightly dazed by the price of the scotch in his hand. Then came the inner circle. Sienna's bridesmaids, Tyler's groomsmen, and a couple of micro-influencers who were filming their cocktails for their stories. I walked the length of the table. Twice. Sloane followed, her hand resting lightly on my arm, her touch the only thing keeping me grounded. There was no card for Julian. There was no card for Sloane. Maybe they put us at the other end? Sloane whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the rising heat behind my eyes. But the table ended at a decorative floral arrangement. We weren't at the table. We weren't even near it. I looked up and caught Sienna's eye. She was draped in a sequined white jumpsuit, her blonde hair styled in perfect, effortless waves. She was holding a flute of pink champagne, looking every bit the star she believed herself to be. She saw me, smiled that practiced, toothy smile she used for sponsored posts, and glided over. She didn't hug me. She did that strange, hovering gesture people do when they're more concerned with their makeup than the person they're greeting. Julian. You actually came, she chirped, her voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. I told Mom you'd probably be too busy with your coding thing. You're always so focused on those little screens. I wouldn't miss it, Sienna, I said, my voice leveled to a flat, professional calm. But I think there's been a mistake with the seating. She laughed, a sharp, tittering sound that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, no mistake, Jules. This table is just for the core team. You know, the people who are helping with the content strategy for the wedding. It's very high energy. We thought you'd be much more comfortable at the lounge seating by the bar. It's way more low-key. More your speed. She gestured vaguely toward a pair of uncomfortable-looking velvet stools tucked into a dark corner near the service entrance. Plus, she added, leaning in as if sharing a secret, Sloane's dress is a bit dark for the photos we're taking at the main table. It would throw off the palette. And just like that, she was gone, twirling back to her core team to toast to a future I was apparently only allowed to watch from the periphery. I stood there for a moment, the sound of the party fading into a dull roar. I wasn't hurt. I was fascinated. It was a perfect display of the system at work. The exclusion, the casual belittlement, the utter lack of awareness that the man she had just pushed into the shadows was the only reason she had a shadow to stand in. The dinner was a slow-motion car crash of vanity. From our stools at the bar, Sloane and I watched the core team feast on Wagyu sliders and truffle-infused everything. My father gave a toast that was mostly about how blessed they were to have a daughter who brought so much light to the world. My mother beamed. Sienna stood up and gave a speech about manifesting her destiny and how this wedding would be a global celebration of love. She didn't mention me once. Not as a brother, not as a guest, not even as an afterthought. I sat there, sipping a whiskey that cost more than my first car, and watched them. I watched the way they used each other. I watched the way the influencers angled their phones to catch the light. I realized that this wasn't a family gathering. It was a production. And every production needs a financier. Near the end of the night, as the guests began to filter toward the elevators, a waiter in a crisp black vest approached our corner. He looked hesitant, glancing back at the main table before turning to me. He held a small, leather-bound folder. "Sir," he said softly. "The hostess said you'd be handling the final settlement for the evening." I didn't move. I felt Sloane's hand tighten on my knee. "The settlement?" I asked. The waiter opened the folder. Inside was a bill that made my stomach turn. $30,000. For 4 hours of curated atmosphere, an open bar for people I didn't know, and a content capture fee for the venue's social media team. At the bottom, in Sienna's loopy, practiced handwriting, was a note, Julian will take care of this. He's the successful one. I looked at the note. Then I looked over at the main table. Sienna was surrounded by her friends, laughing as she looked at something on her phone. My mother was hugging Tyler, already treating him like the son she'd always wanted. They weren't even looking at me. They were waiting for the transaction to complete so they could go home and sleep in the comfort of a bill they assumed was already paid. "We're not on the guest list," Sloane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a cutting, academic precision that silenced the waiter. She stood up, her dark dress catching the dim light of the bar. She looked at the waiter, then at the folder, and then directly at me. "Julian, we weren't invited to sit. Why would we be invited to pay?" She took my hand and pulled me toward the elevator. The waiter stood there, stunned, the leather folder hanging limply in his hand. As the elevator doors began to slide shut, I caught one last glimpse of the rooftop. The lights were still bright, the music was still playing, but the core team was starting to look around. Sienna's head turned, her eyes scanning the room, searching for the man who always made the problems go away. She didn't find him. "This is it, isn't it?" Sloane asked as we descended toward the street. "The bridge is gone." "No," I said, watching the floor numbers flash by in the dark. "The bridge is still there. I'm just changing where it leads." As we stepped out into the rain, I pulled out my phone. I didn't call Sienna. I didn't text my mother. I went into my email and found a draft I'd been working on for months. It was a simple notification to the trustees of the family's discretionary fund, the one I had been quietly subsidizing for 5 years. I hit delete. Then, I opened a new browser tab and typed in a URL for an estate I had been watching for a long time. A place of marble, shadows, and old secrets. The Blackwood Estate. I turned to Sloane as we reached the car. "They want a dream wedding," I said softly. "I think it's time I gave them one they'll never forget." I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the New York fog. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from Sienna, "Jules. The waiter is being so weird about the bill. Can you just Venmo the venue? I'll pay you back once the sponsorship check clears. Love you." I didn't reply. I just watched the road, a cold, quiet smile spreading across my face. She thought the bill was the end of the story. She had no idea it was just the opening credits. The silence that followed the engagement party was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stayed away from the family group chats, leaving my phone face down on my desk like a live grenade. I knew the cycle by heart. First would come the confused pings, then the frantic calls, and finally the guilt-tripping texts from my mother about family solidarity. But this time, I didn't wait for the explosion. I retreated into the one place where I held absolute sovereignty, the digital architecture of my home office. In the glow of 3 high-definition monitors, I wasn't the disposable brother or the tech guy. I was a ghost in the machine. I spent the first 48 hours after the rooftop debacle mapping out the terrain of Sienna's vanity. I studied her engagement metrics, her brand contracts, and her public-facing vision boards. I realized that Sienna wasn't planning a wedding, she was scripting a series of high-conversion events. And she had already cast me in the role of the silent financier. On Monday morning, the bait was set. Sienna posted a life update video. She sat on her white boucle sofa, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually wet, and told her followers that the engagement dinner had been transformative. Then came the line that made my blood run cold: "We are so blessed to announce that my incredible brother Julian, the genius behind so much of our family's success, has stepped up to fully fund our dream venue. He's always been my protector, and now he's making sure my fairy tale comes true." The comments were a landslide of praise. She was using the weight of 40,000 strangers to crush me into compliance. If I denied it, I was the villain who ruined a bride's dream in front of the whole world. If I stayed silent, she would bleed me dry. It was a classic pincer move, the kind she had used since we were children. But Sienna had forgotten one thing: I am a systems architect. I don't get trapped by pincer moves, I rewrite the logic of the trap itself. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light reflecting in my glasses. I didn't call her to demand a retraction. I didn't send an angry text. Instead, I opened a hidden folder on my encrypted drive. It was time to initiate the Golden Child Protocol. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. This was a forensic audit of a lifetime of being sidelined. If Sienna wanted me to be her protector, I would be exactly that. I would protect her from the reality of her own choices until the very moment the floor dropped out from under her. I began to build the fixer persona, a sophisticated, digital shadow that would handle every problem she was about to face. I didn't need a shout to start a war. I just needed a stable internet connection and the total absence of mercy. To understand why I was willing to burn it all down, you have to understand the history of the low-maintenance son. In my family, the squeaky wheel didn't just get the oil, it got the entire store. My childhood was a series of quiet erasures. I remember being 16, standing in the hallway with a thick envelope from a prestigious summer engineering program I'd worked 2 years to get into. I was shaking with excitement. But when I walked into the kitchen, my mother was crying over Sienna's credit card statement. Sienna had spent $3,000 on prom prep and aesthetic upgrades for her friend group. "Julian, honey," my mother had said, not even looking at my envelope, "we're going to need to use your savings to cover this. We can't have Sienna's reputation ruined over a few dresses. You're the strong one. You understand, right?" I had looked at the envelope, then at the desperate, hollow look in my mother's eyes, and I had handed it over. I was the strong one. I was the one who could handle disappointment so Sienna didn't have to. That pattern became the blueprint of our lives. When I got my first promotion, the celebration was cut short because Sienna had a crisis with a boyfriend that required my immediate attention and a 4-hour drive to pick her up. When I bought my first apartment, my father asked me if I could put Sienna on the deed just for the credit building, as if my hard-earned equity was just another family resource to be shared. I was the golden child in reverse, the one whose shine was used solely to illuminate someone else's stage. They saw my reliability as a lack of ambition, and my silence as a lack of feeling. They mocked my tech stuff while using the dividends from my tech stuff to buy the champagne they didn't invite me to drink. The emotional peak wasn't one single event, it was the cumulative weight of 10,000 small dismissals. It was the realization that if I disappeared tomorrow, they wouldn't mourn the man, they would mourn the ATM. As I sat in my office, scrolling through years of bank transfers and ignored thank you notes, the last flicker of familial guilt died out. I wasn't just Julian anymore. I was the architect of their reckoning. The transformation began with a single email. I created a high-end alias, an executive concierge service called Ethelred & Company, and reached out to Sienna. I told her that, as a gift from her brother, I had retained their services to handle the logistical complexities of her high-profile wedding. She didn't even ask for a phone number. She just saw the elegant gold-leaf digital letterhead and the promise of exclusive access and she took the bait. I became her fixer. I moved into the shadows of her planning process, monitoring her every move. When her original venue fell through because she'd neglected to pay the deposit. Too busy buying a designer wardrobe for her engagement shoot, I was there. I sent her a message from Ethelred: "Do not worry, Miss Sienna. Your brother has authorized us to secure something far more fitting for your brand. Have you heard of the Blackwood estate?" Blackwood was a legend in the New England coastal circuit. A sprawling, Gothic Revival manor with ivy-choked walls and a glass conservatory that looked like it had been grown rather than built. It was currently under legal lockdown due to a messy international auction, which made it the perfect weapon. It was stunningly photogenic and completely inaccessible. I spent hours crafting a paper palace. I mocked up fake contracts with real-sounding jargon about private equity bookings and NDA-restricted access. I created a virtual paper trail of confirmed catering, floral arrangements, and lighting rigs. I even sent her sneak peek photos of the estate's interior. Photos I had gathered from deep web architectural archives. Sienna was ecstatic. She spent her days posting about her exclusive coastal manor and how some people just have the connections to make magic happen. She was so blinded by the glow of her own reflection that she never noticed the cracks in the foundation. She didn't notice that the confirmation emails came from a domain I had registered 48 hours prior. She didn't notice that the deposit receipts were just PDF copies of my own internal ledger transfers. I was feeding her exactly what she wanted, the image of success without the burden of truth. I was the architect, the contractor, and the foreman of her downfall. And as the wedding date approached, the pieces were moving with a terrifying, mechanical precision. But to ensure the fall was total, I needed one more thing: someone who could document the collapse from the inside. Someone who had as much reason to hate the system as I did. I pulled up a contact I hadn't used in 5 years, my finger hovering over the dial icon. It was time to call the one family member who had already been burned at the stake. The dial tone hissed in my ear like a fuse burning toward a powder keg. I hadn't spoken to Leo in 5 years, not since the infamous Sunday brunch where Sienna had informed him, in front of the entire family, that his lifestyle choices were hurting the family brand. Leo was a photographer of brutal, haunting talent, a man who saw the world in high contrast and deep shadows. When the family exiled him for refusing to be a background character in their heteronormative fantasy, I was the only one who had sent him a check to get his first studio started. I didn't do it out of charity, I did it because even then, I knew I'd eventually need a witness who couldn't be bought. When he picked up, his voice was like gravel under a heavy boot. "Julian," he said, "no greeting, no surprise. I figured you'd be too busy signing checks for the princess's coronation to call a ghost." I didn't waste time on apologies. I told him about the rooftop, the $30,000 bill, and the fake venue. I told him I needed a ghost photographer, someone to document a wedding that was never going to happen. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then, Leo started to laugh. It was a cold, jagged sound. "You want me to capture the moment the mask slips," he whispered. "You want the high-resolution files of the family legacy catching fire." I told him I'd pay his triple rate, plus expenses, and that he would have total creative control over the final gallery. I didn't want wedding photos, I wanted an autopsy. Leo agreed before I could even finish the sentence. He was the final component of the machine. While I managed the digital mirage, Leo would be the eyes on the ground, the man with the lens who would ensure that when the dream evaporated, there would be undeniable, cinematic proof of the mess left behind. "I'll be there, Julian," he said. "And don't worry. I'll make sure I get her good side, especially when she realizes the gates are locked." With Leo secured, the construction of the mirage moved into its final, most dangerous phase. A wedding isn't just a ceremony. It's a logistics operation involving dozens of moving parts, each one a potential point of failure for my plan. I had to ensure that Sienna believed everything was perfectly in place while ensuring that not a single vendor was actually contracted to show up at the Blackwood estate. This was the paper palace, a masterpiece of misinformation. I spent 16 hours a day in my office, creating a network of ghost entities. I didn't just send fake emails, I built digital identities. I created Viridian Florals, Crestline Catering, and Lumina Sound and Light. I built minimalist websites for each, populated with high-end stock photos of coastal weddings, and linked them all back to a central hub that I controlled. When Sienna reached out to verify a booking, she was redirected to a VoIP line that patched directly through to my headset, where I used an AI voice modulator to play the part of a harried, high-end event coordinator. "Yes, Miss Sienna, the peonies have been sourced from France," I'd say, my voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Your brother has seen to every detail. The Blackwood estate is preparing for your arrival." The psychological weight of the lie was immense. I watched through her social media as she spiraled into a fever of self-importance. She was posting behind-the-scenes content of her exclusive vendor meetings that were actually just her talking to my digital shadows. She was manifesting a reality that didn't exist, building a castle in the air with my hands beneath it. Sloane would watch me from the doorway of my office, her eyes full of a quiet, clinical concern. "You're building a god, Julian," she said one night, her voice barely a whisper. "And you know what happens to gods when the believers find out they've been praying to a statue?" I didn't answer. I was too far gone into the architecture of the fall. I wasn't just Julian anymore. I was the ghost in her machine, the architect of a fairy tale that was designed to end in a nightmare. The final stroke of the setup was the gift registry. This was where Sloane's expertise in human behavior became my greatest weapon. Sienna had already launched her official registry, a grotesque list of luxury items, travel funds for a 3-week honeymoon in Bora Bora, and high-end electronics that neither she nor Tyler knew how to use. It was the ultimate grab for cash, a digital collection plate passed around to followers she had never met. Sloane and I decided to give her a shadow registry. We used a secondary, high-end gifting platform and created a mirrored account for the Blackwood nuptials. At first glance, it looked identical to her real one. But as a user scrolled down, the items began to shift. We included things that were subtly, hauntingly off. A $500 atonement candle. A set of silence-grade noise-canceling headphones for Julian. An emotional support cactus that cost more than a month's rent. And at the very bottom, hidden among the crystal vases and linen sets, was a framed, high-resolution photo of the rooftop bill from the engagement party, listed as a family legacy contribution. We didn't send the link to anyone. We didn't have to. In the world of influencers and snark boards, things have a way of finding their own audience. I leaked the link to a single, anonymous Reddit thread dedicated to influencer fails and watched the wildfire spread. Within 12 hours, the Ethelred registry was being dissected by thousands of strangers. They weren't just laughing at the absurdity of a $400 cactus, they were starting to ask questions about the venue, the funding, and the perfect brother who was supposedly paying for it all. The cracks were beginning to show in the public narrative, but Sienna was too busy filming her final fitting to notice the digital ground shifting beneath her feet. She sent a message to the family group chat, her first in weeks, "Everything is perfect. The Blackwood estate is officially locked in. Julian, you really outdid yourself this time. I guess I can finally forgive you for that awkwardness at the rooftop party. See you all at the gates." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the cold, hard lines of my face. I didn't reply. I just looked over at the calendar. The wedding was 48 hours away. The guests were flying in. The core team was ready. And as I closed the final tab on my browser, a single notification popped up on my screen, a private message from an unknown sender that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't from a vendor. It wasn't from a follower. It was from the actual owner of the Blackwood estate, and the subject line was only 2 words, "I see you." The message from the real owner of the Blackwood estate sat on my screen like a digital death warrant. "I see you." For a heartbeat, my internal system stalled. I had accounted for every variable, Sienna's vanity, the family's greed, the vendor's complacency. But I had forgotten the one thing that always ruins a perfect system, the human element at the top of the food chain. I didn't panic. I traced the metadata of the message. It hadn't come through a hacked server, it had come from a man named Sterling Vance, the reclusive billionaire who actually owned the cliffs and the glass conservatory where Sienna planned to film her apotheosis. He wasn't angry. He was curious. I reached out to him under my real name. I didn't offer a lie, I offered a trade. I told him exactly what I was doing. I told him about the $30,000 bill, the invisible sun syndrome, and the fake contracts. I told him I wasn't trying to trespass, I was trying to stage a play where the lead actress finally had to face an empty theater. There was a pause that lasted an eternity. Then, a reply came back, "I despise influencers. They treat my legacy like a backdrop for their cheap commerce. You have the estate for the afternoon of the 17th. Security will be informed. Do not disappoint me, Julian. The "I see you" wasn't a threat, it was an invitation to the execution. Sloane and I sat in our kitchen that night, the air thick with the electric hum of the endgame. We didn't talk about the what-ifs. We talked about the when. I watched her hands as she folded a silk scarf, her movements deliberate and calm. She knew I had crossed a line that most people don't even know exists. I had weaponized my silence and turned my reliability into a scalpel. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop. A text from Sienna: "I couldn't do this without you, Julian. You're finally earning your place in this family. See you at the altar, big brother." I didn't feel a sting of guilt. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. She thought she was welcoming me into the fold. She had no idea she was just closing the door behind her. I deleted the message, turned off the phone, and for the first time in months, I slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The trap was no longer just digital, it was made of stone, glass, and a billionaire's boredom. The morning of June 17th broke with a clarity that felt almost violent. The New England coast was bathed in a pale, golden light, the kind of magic hour glow that Sienna had spent her entire life trying to manufacture with filters. I stood on the balcony of our hotel, miles away from the Blackwood estate, watching the tide pull back from the rocks. It was a metaphor I couldn't ignore. The water retreats, exposing everything that's been hidden beneath the surface, the jagged edges, the debris, the things that shouldn't be seen in the light. Today, the tide was going out on the family name. I had spent the early hours checking the kill switches one last time. The ghost VoIP lines were deactivated. The Ethelred website was a 404 error. The fake catering and floral confirmation numbers were now routing to a pre-recorded message of static. I had even sent one final update to Sienna's phone from a burner account, telling her that the VIP entrance was through the north gate, the one that was currently chained shut with a rusted padlock. I was the architect of a masterpiece that was designed to vanish the moment it was touched. At 3 in the afternoon, the Blackwood estate was a silent fortress. I knew, through a hidden cellular camera I'd paid a local teenager to tuck into a tree near the entrance, that the caravan was approaching. I could see the dust rising from the coastal road. First came the black SUVs, Sienna's core team and the micro-influencers she'd promised the exclusive of the century. Then came the luxury vans carrying the family. I saw my mother's face through a window, her expression one of triumphant smugness. She was finally the mother of a Blackwood bride. She was finally where she felt she belonged. I sat in a quiet cafe 2 blocks away, Sloane beside me, a laptop open on the table. We weren't there to watch the wedding, we were there to watch the system fail. Leo, my ghost photographer, was already in position, perched on a rocky outcropping with a 600mm lens. He was the only one who had the real VIP access. He wasn't there to take portraits, he was there to document the collapse of a dynasty. My screen flickered to life with a live feed from Leo's camera. I watched as the lead SUV pulled up to the north gate. I watched as Tyler, looking uncomfortable in a $3,000 suit he hadn't paid for, hopped out to open the gate. He pulled at the chain. He pulled again. He looked at the padlock, then back at the car. The play had begun. The heart-hitting peak of a tragedy isn't the moment of death, it's the moment of realization. It's the split second when the brain understands that the floor is no longer there. For my family, that moment happened at 4:12 p.m. I watched the live feed as my mother climbed out of the van, her silk dress fluttering in the sea breeze. She walked up to the gate, her face contorting with a mix of confusion and mounting fury. She reached for her phone, the same phone she had used to ignore me for years. I knew my phone was vibrating in my pocket. I didn't need to look at it to know it was her. Then came the call from Sienna. Then the call from my father. I let them ring. I let the vibration hum against my leg like a restless heart. I was no longer the fixer. I was no longer the man who made the problems go away. I was the silent observer of the catastrophe I had carefully curated. I finally answered the 4th call from my mother. Her voice wasn't the sweet, patronizing tone she used when she wanted a favor. It was a jagged, panicked shriek. "Julian! Where are you? The gates are locked. The security guard says there's no reservation. He says he's never heard of you. Julian, talk to me." I stood up and walked to the window of the cafe, looking out toward the distant, hidden estate. "I know, Mom," I said. My voice was a flat, calm line. "The security guard is right. There is no reservation." There was a silence on the other end of the line that felt like a physical weight. I could hear the wind whistling through her phone, and in the background, I heard Sienna's voice, a high, thin wail of pure, unadulterated ego. "What do you mean?" my mother whispered. You sent the receipts, you told Sienna everything was handled." "I did what you've always done to me," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I gave you a role to play in a story that wasn't real. I made you feel important while I used you as a prop. I've been the low-maintenance son for 28 years, Mom. I've been the chair you sit on, the safety net you never thank. Today, I decided to be the tide. I decided to pull back and show the world exactly what's left when the invisible sun stops holding up the roof." I could hear her breathing, shallow, panicked gasps. "Julian, please, you can't do this. There are people here. Influencers. The press. Sienna's career, her life is over if this doesn't happen." "Her life isn't over, Mom," I said, watching a seagull circle the pier. "Her lie is over. There's a difference. You should probably tell her to watch her mascara. Leo is taking photos, and he's using a very high-quality lens." I hung up the phone. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. I felt a profound, hollow peace. I looked back at the laptop screen. The core team was beginning to scatter. The micro-influencers were already filming, their phones held high like torches. They weren't filming a wedding. They were filming a scandal. And then, I saw the one thing I hadn't planned for. A black sedan, separate from the wedding party, pulled up to the gate. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a tablet. He wasn't security. He wasn't a guest. He was a server, and as he approached my mother, he tapped a single button on his screen that sent a notification to every phone in the vicinity, a final, digital gift from the ghost at the feast. The notification that hit every phone at the Blackwood gate wasn't a message from me, at least, not directly. It was the automated live gallery push from the secondary registry we had built. As the guests, the bridesmaids, and the core team stood in the gravel of a locked estate, their screens lit up with a curated feed of the truth. It was a digital gallery of the Ethelred registry. The $400 cacti, the adult bibs, and, most devastatingly, the $30,000 rooftop bill, now labeled as the golden child's final invoice. The big reveal wasn't a single moment, it was a cascading failure of optics. I watched through Leo's lens as the micro-influencers realized the story wasn't the dream wedding, but the grand fraud. They pivoted in real time. They didn't help Sienna, they filmed her. The very people she had invited to validate her existence were now the vultures picking at her bones. Leo's camera captured it with a cruel, surgical precision. Sienna, in her 5-figure white gown, clutching the iron bars of the gate like a prisoner, while behind her, a bridesmaid was already live-streaming the meltdown. The ghost's gallery was live, and the world was watching the architecture of a lie crumble. I watched through the lens as my father walked away from the group, his shoulders slumped, a man finally realizing that the son he had ignored was the only thing that had been keeping the rain off his head. My mother remained at the gate, screaming at a security guard who didn't exist, her voice a thin, ragged sound that was swallowed by the Atlantic wind. The system hadn't just failed, it had inverted. The invisible was now the only thing anyone could see. The fallout was a slow-motion demolition. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the Blackwood hoax was trending globally. Sienna's brand didn't just stumble, it vanished. Sponsors don't just leave when a scandal hits, they claw back their advances. I watched as the blue checkmarks disappeared, as the core team deleted their tags, and as the followers, those 43,000 people she lived for, turned into a digital mob. But the real damage wasn't in the comments section. It was in the quiet of the aftermath. Within 48 hours, the perfect family was a collection of strangers living in a house built on credit and broken promises. My mother called me once more, her voice hollow and devoid of the old fire. She didn't ask for money this time. She didn't offer a guilt trip. She just asked, why? I told her the truth, because you raised me to be invisible, Mom. And I just wanted to see what happened to your world when I finally disappeared for real. Sienna tried to release a redemption video, sat on the floor of her apartment in a gray sweatshirt, trying to play the victim of a cruel, calculated sabotage. But the internet has a long memory and a short attention span for fake tears. The Ethelred registry had already become a meme. The image of her screaming at a locked gate had become the universal symbol for influencer hubris. She had spent her life trying to be the star of a movie, and I had ensured that the only footage left was the blooper reel. She was no longer a brand, she was a cautionary tale. The month after the wedding was the quietest of my life. Sloane and I moved into our new home, a place of heavy timber and deep windows, tucked away in a neighborhood where nobody knew Sienna's name. There are no glass walls here. There is no neon. There is only the steady, rhythmic sound of the wind in the trees and the quiet breathing of a life that is finally mine. I kept one thing from the wreckage, a single, printed photograph that Leo sent me. It's not a shot of the gate or the guests. It's a shot of the Blackwood estate at dusk, after everyone had left. The house is a dark, silent silhouette against a bruised sky. It looks exactly like it is, a fortress that refused to be a backdrop. I hung it in the back of my closet, a small, private monument to the day I stopped being a utility and started being a man. I don't hate them anymore. Hate is an investment, and I've closed that account. Sometimes, late at night, I'll see a notification for a suggested post featuring someone like Sienna, someone smiling for a camera, selling a dream, living a life that requires 1,000 small lies to maintain. I don't feel anger. I feel a strange, distant pity. I know what it's like to be the ghost in that machine. I know what it's like to be the one holding up the floor. I leaned back in my chair in my new office, the green light of the forest outside replacing the blue light of the monitors. I looked at Sloane, who was reading by the fire, a glass of wine in her hand and a look of absolute, unburdened peace on her face. I didn't just get revenge. I didn't just balance the books. I got free. And as I closed my laptop for the night, I realized that the greatest power isn't in being seen. It's in knowing exactly who you are when the cameras finally stop clicking. I am Julian. I am the architect. And for the first time in 28 years, I am home.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.